Hello. I know it's been a really long time since you guys see me fabricate anything since that Red Hood helmet, but I've come bearing news. Redicus Props, I had commissioned him a couple months ago. He is the same man that actually modeled the reverse flash helmet for me and sent the parts to me so that I can whip it up and make it happen. And so he had just got done and sent me the parts to my next cosplay slash fabrication and paint job. It's going to be a flash helmet, but not just any old flash helmet. It is a design out of the Injustice 2 video game. Now, jumping right into this build, I pulled out some steel files, and these make very light work of these plastic printed parts. Next, I have this 2-part epoxy from Gorilla Glue, and what I'm doing is joining all the parts together crudely so that I can smooth them out with Bondo and etc, with a lot more sanding. Now for the smaller, more intricate pieces, I glued them together with super glue, and eventually I will hit them with XTC 3D. I don't like to sand and manhandle these smaller parts because they are very delicate at the ends, and last thing I want to do is break them because I have no replacements. While I set that aside, I begin attacking the helmet with some steel files, just trying to smooth out as much as I can before I start applying primer filler and such. Being that this came in 12 parts, there were continuous alignment issues, so I went in with epoxy sculpt. It's an A and B kind of material, you just mix it together, and I applied that on the main wing down the middle of the head to fill in the gap, and I've just, of course, smoothed out everything else. Now, it is important to note that once you layer on a pretty good coat of primer filler, you would want to wet sand from here on out, mainly because if you go in with any grit dry, the primer filler does gunk up sandpaper very easily, so it's best to just from here on out wet sand. And I'm attacking it with 240 grit. Now after that sanding session, I'm hitting it with primer, a bright primer preferably. It's what I like to use because it gives me a better vantage point to see a lot of the divots and things I need to fill and or tone down. Now that I've laid down my coat of primer and analyzed the helmet for any imperfections, I'm going in with wood filler. Wood filler is a compound that I really like to use for medium indentations or divots. Bondo is what I like to use for bigger holes and gaps that I need to fill. So it goes from Bondo, bigger gaps or holes, medium holes, I like to use wood filler because it sands really easy. And then finally the last step would be the glazing spot putty. And here I am layering another coat of primer filler after I had applied and sand down the wood filler. Again, after analyzing the helmet, this is me sanding down the glazing spot putty, and then I laid down a yellow primer to repeat the same thing. So those little pink spots you may see are from the glazing spot putty, and from here on out it's nothing but wet sanding from 400 grit making my way up to 2500 grit. I'm sorry for the change in orientation, that kind of does happen throughout the video. Doesn't happen often, and this is me test fitting the helmet. I stressed so hard trying to figure out how I'm going to get my head into this helmet until I ended up coming up with the idea of engineering slash putting sculpting, actually epoxy sculpt little tubes to connect the bottom back plate to the top, and I drilled and put strong magnets on the ends, so there's 3 points or 3 magnetic points for the connection. This is me just test fitting, getting an idea of what it's going to look like together. You know, I like to visualize things. Now to prep for paint. What I'm doing is rubbing down the ear wing with rubbing alcohol and a paper towel to remove any hand grime or just dust left over that I might have missed. And I've made my way with those from, again, 400 grit to 2500 grit. Right now I'm just painting the surface primer that dries in a gloss finish, which would be essential to have because I'm going to be chroming them soon. Again, I'm sorry for the orientation change. This is what it looks like with just a black gloss. And right here is Spastix Mirror Chrome. You want to lay this down very thinly until you build a pretty good layer of it, until it gets a kind of a dusty effect. Then you just go in with a microfiber cloth and give it a light buff. And here is another product from Spastix. This is Spastix Candy Yellow. Now for the chrome on the helmet, it's a duplicolor chrome, the same chrome I used on the Red Hood, and I kind of went experimental with this paint job. I had hand drawn these stencils and transferred over the stencil onto a silicone mat, and I cut them all out in order to create a certain effect. Now this is out of a laundry bag. This is what the top of the skull looks like, and I decided to go with the cubed stencil on the bottom portion of the jaw. Now for the paint scheme of this, I wanted a lot of fade in, fade outs, so I did go in with candy black and do some shading to give some kind of weathering. Now time to tackle the visor. Truth be told, I'm kind of nervous. It'd be smart to wear eye protection and be very careful when handling this. I have my metal cutting tool, so let's get it going. Now for the big reveal, what I've waited for 2 months of just hard work and sanding. What I did off camera is a lot more weathering, but with a brush and watered down acrylic black. And then I took my Molotow chrome paint pen and went along the edges of certain parts just to get a separation between the panel lines and what's on top and stacked on one another. And then another thing I did off camera is go back to all these items and sand them with 2500 grit and then polish them with turtle wax. Now here is me putting it on. As mentioned previously earlier in the video about epoxy sculpt and some strong magnets, it makes putting on this helmet a breeze. It's very snug, and the only problem I see or experience while putting on this helmet is that my ears stick out further than well, the helmet doesn't allow my ears to live, so I kind of have to tuck those in. But while I tuck those in and put this helmet on, my ears are pushing out the ear wings, so that's kind of frustrating. And then off camera I decided to tint the visor, and this is just a little bit of a view of what it looks like. Since my vacuum former didn't show up, I have this placeholder visor that I did cut out. I don't plan on necessarily wearing this. It's going to be for display purposes. Once my vacuum former does show up, of course I'll make that happen. I'm thinking about having a reflective blue, a pitch black one, which would be awesome. Now the reason why this is a placeholder visor is you can see this thing is not perfectly flush. There's a hard curve there which I couldn't heat, and bend to form this helmet perfectly. But it gives you a good idea as to what this helmet looks like with the black visor. Now, if you appreciate this build, go ahead and follow me on Instagram as well, mainly because there's a lot of background stuff that's in the works, and I don't necessarily update my YouTube channel as fast as I would like to. So Instagram gets everything first. My ideas, my thoughts, my advice, open to any questions and things of that nature. So please go ahead and follow me there. And yeah, thank you for watching this entire build. Hopefully you learned something. Have a good day.